title of our 8th lecture is Who Was Jesus? Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims are the proper context for exploring the fact of Jesus' resurrection. An event without a context is inherently ambiguous. That's especially true for an alleged miracle. Considered in isolation, an alleged miracle might be no more than a scientific aberration, a freak of nature. The resurrection of Jesus should not, therefore, be considered in isolation, but finds its proper interpretive context in Jesus' ministry and radical personal claims. So, before we look at the historical credibility of Jesus' resurrection, let's set the stage by asking who Jesus thought himself to be. Now, immediately we confront a problem. Since Jesus himself didn't leave behind any writings of his own, we're dependent upon the records of others for knowing what Jesus said and did. Now, this situation isn't unusual for figures of antiquity. For example, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates also left behind no writings of his own. We're dependent upon his disciple, Plato, for most of our knowledge of Socrates' life and teaching. In the same way, we're dependent upon the records of Jesus' followers for his life and teaching. But while this situation isn't unusual, it does occasion the question, how do we know that these records are accurate? Maybe Jesus' followers said that he said and did certain things which he really didn't. In particular, since the early Christians believed that Jesus was God, maybe they made up sayings and stories to that effect and ascribed them to Jesus. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus in the Gospels makes claims and does things implying his divinity. Maybe the historical Jesus who really lived was quite different from the divine figure that we read about in the Gospels. How can we tell if these records are historically accurate? Well, up until the modern era, these sorts of questions were basically unanswerable. But with the rise of textual criticism and the modern study of history, historians began to develop the tools to unlock these questions. Today, Jesus is no longer just a figure in a stained glass window, but a real flesh and blood person of history, just like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, whose life can be investigated using the standard methods of history. The writings contained in the New Testament can be scrutinized by the same historical criteria that we use in investigating other sources of ancient history, like Thucydides' Peloponnesian War or the Annals of Tacitus. Now, the first thing that we need to do in order to conduct a historical investigation of Jesus is to assemble our sources. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in a range of ancient sources, both inside and outside the New Testament, including Christian, Roman, and Jewish sources. This is really quite extraordinary when you reflect on how obscure a figure Jesus was, having at most had a 3-year public life as an itinerant Galilean preacher. We have far more information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most major figures of antiquity. The most important of these historical sources have been collected into the New Testament. References to Jesus outside the New Testament tend to confirm what we read in the Gospels, but they don't really tell us anything new. And therefore, the focus of our attention must be upon the documents of the New Testament. Now, I find that many laymen don't understand this procedure. They think that if you examine the New Testament writings themselves, rather than look at sources outside the New Testament, then somehow you're reasoning in a circle, using the Bible to prove the Bible. If you even quote a passage out of the New Testament, they think that somehow you're begging the question, presupposing that the New Testament is reliable. But that's not at all what historians are doing when they examine the New Testament. They're not treating the Bible as a wholly inspired book and then trying to prove it's true by quoting it. Rather, they're treating the New Testament as any other collection of ancient documents and investigating whether these documents are historically reliable. It's important to understand in this connection that originally there wasn't any such book called the New Testament. There were just these separate documents handed down out of the first century, things like the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel of John, the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, and so on. It wasn't until a couple of centuries later that the church officially collected all of these documents under one cover, which came to be known as the New Testament. The church included in the New Testament only the earliest sources which were closest to Jesus and the original disciples, and left out the later secondary accounts like the forged apocryphal Gospels, which everybody knew were fakes. So, from the very nature of the case, the best historical sources were included in the New Testament. People who insist on evidence taken only from sources outside the New Testament don't understand what they're asking us to do. They're demanding that we ignore the earliest primary sources about Jesus in favor of sources which are later and secondary and less reliable, which is just mad as historical methodology. This is important because all of the radical reconstructions of the historical Jesus in the news today are based on later writings outside the New Testament. In particular, the so-called apocryphal Gospels. What are the apocryphal Gospels? Well, they're Gospels forged under the apostles' names. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so forth. They first began to appear in the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. Revisionists claim that these extra-biblical writings are the key to correctly reconstructing the historical Jesus. Professor Luke Johnson, a distinguished New Testament scholar at Emory University, points out that all of the recent spate of books claiming to uncover the real Jesus follow the same predictable pattern. 1, the book begins by trumpeting the scholarly credentials of its author and his prodigious research. 2, the author claims to offer some new, maybe even suppressed interpretation of who Jesus really was. 3, the truth about Jesus is said to be discovered by means of sources outside the Bible, which enable us to read the Gospels in a new way which is at odds with their face value meaning. 4, this new interpretation is provocative and maybe even titillating. For example, that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, or was the leader of a hallucinogenic cult, or a peasant cynic philosopher. And 5, it is implied that traditional Christian beliefs are therefore undermined and need to be revised. If you hear of books following this familiar pattern, then your critical antennae should immediately go up. You are about to be duped. For the fact is that there is no source outside the New Testament which calls into question the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels. The apocryphal Gospels are later derivative writings shaped by the theology of the 2nd century and later. And what this means is that despite all the hoopla, the documents contained in the New Testament are our primary sources for the life of Jesus. So, try not to think of the New Testament as a single book. Think of it as what it originally was. Just a bunch of separate documents written in the Greek language coming down to us out of the 1st century, telling this remarkable story about Jesus of Nazareth. And the question then must be, how historically reliable are these documents? Here we confront the very crucial question of the burden of proof. Should we assume that the Gospels are reliable unless they're proven to be unreliable? Or should we assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless they are proven to be reliable? Are they innocent until proven guilty? Or are they guilty until proven innocent? Skeptical scholars almost always assume that the Gospels are guilty until proven innocent. That is to say, they assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless and until they are proven to be correct on some specific fact. And I'm not exaggerating here. This really is the modus operandi of skeptical critics. I want to list, however, 5 reasons why I think that this skeptical assumption is wrong. 1, there was insufficient time for legendary influences to expunge the core historical facts. Sometimes laymen say, how can you know anything that happened 2,000 years ago? What they fail to understand is that the crucial time gap is not the gap between the evidence and today. Rather, what is important is the gap between the evidence and the original events that the evidence is about. If the gap between the events and the evidence about them is short, then it doesn't matter how far the event and the evidence have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the passage of time. So long as the time gap between the event and the evidence for that event is short, it's just irrelevant how long it has been to the present day. The question then is how close the sources for Jesus' life are to the time he lived. And I'll say something more about that in a minute. 2, the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or contemporary urban legends. Tales like those of Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill or contemporary urban legends like the Vanishing Hitchhiker rarely concern actual historical individuals and are thus not like the gospel narratives, which are about real people who actually lived, real events that actually occurred, and real places that actually existed. You can read about people like John the Baptist, Pontius Pilate, and Joseph Caiaphas in secular sources outside the New Testament. 3, the Jewish transmission of sacred traditions was highly developed and reliable. In an oral culture like that of first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and retain large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. From the earliest age, children were taught in the home, in elementary school, and in the synagogue to memorize faithfully sacred tradition. The disciples would have exercised similar care with the teachings of Jesus. 4, there were significant restraints on the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, such as the presence of eyewitnesses and the apostles' supervision. Since those who had seen and heard Jesus continued to live, and the tradition about Jesus remained under the supervision of the original apostles, these factors would act as a natural check on tendencies to elaborate the facts in a direction contrary to that preserved by those who had known Jesus. And finally, number 5, the gospel records have a proven track record of historical reliability. Where the gospel writers can be checked, they are usually shown to be reliable. Discrepancies are the exception, not the norm. Now, I don't have time to discuss all 5 of these points, but let me say something about the first and the 5th points. The first point, you remember, was that there is insufficient time for legendary influences to expunge the historical facts. No modern scholar thinks of the Gospels as bald-faced lies, the result of a massive conspiracy. The only places that you read such conspiracy theories is on atheist websites on the internet, sensationalist popular books and movies, and former propaganda from behind the Iron Curtain. When you read the pages of the New Testament, there's no doubt that these people sincerely believed the truth of what they proclaimed. Rather, ever since the 19th century, skeptical scholars have explained away the Gospels as legends, like stories of Robin Hood or King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. As the stories about Jesus were passed on over the decades, they got muddled and exaggerated and mythologized until the original facts were all but lost. The Jewish teacher was transformed into the divine Son of God. One of the major problems with the legend hypothesis, however, which is almost never addressed by skeptical critics, is that the time gap between Jesus' death and the writings of the gospel was just too short for this to have happened. This point has been well explained by A.N. Sherwin-White in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. Professor Sherwin-White is not a theologian. He is a professional Greco-Roman historian of the era roughly contemporaneous with Jesus of Nazareth. According to Sherwin-White, the sources for Roman and Greek history that he has to work with are usually biased and usually removed 1 or 2 generations or even centuries from the events that they record. And yet, he says, historians reconstruct with confidence the course of Roman and Greek history. For example, the 2 earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch more than 400 years after Alexander's death. The earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death, and yet classical historians still consider them to be trustworthy. The fabulous legends about Alexander the Great did not arise until during the centuries after these 2 writers. According to Sherwin-White, the writings of the ancient historian Herodotus enable us to determine the rate at which legend accumulates. And he says the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. When Professor Sherwin-White turns to the Gospels, he states that for the Gospels to be legends, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to be unbelievable. All historians agree that the Gospels were written down and circulated during the first generation after the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive. In order for the Gospels to be legendary at the core, more generations would be needed. In fact, adding a time gap of 2 generations to Jesus' death in AD 30 lands you in the 2nd century, when the apocryphal Gospels first begin to appear. These do contain all sorts of fabulous stories about Jesus, trying to fill in the years between his boyhood and the commencement of his ministry, for example. These are better candidates for the legends sought by the critics, not the biblical Gospels. This point becomes even more devastating for criticism when we realize that the Gospels themselves use sources that go back even closer to the events of Jesus' life. For example, the story of Jesus' suffering and death, commonly called the Passion story, was probably not originally written by Mark. Rather, Mark used a source for this narrative. Since Mark is the earliest gospel, his source must be even earlier still. In fact, Rudolf Pesch, a German expert on Mark, says the Passion source must go back to at least AD 37. That's just 7 years after Jesus' death. Or again, Paul, in his letters, hands-on information concerning Jesus about his teaching, his Last Supper, his betrayal, his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection appearances. Paul's letters were written even before the Gospels. And some of his information, for example, what he passes on in his first letter to the Corinthian church about Jesus' resurrection appearances, has been dated to within 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. It just becomes irresponsible to speak of legends in such cases. The fifth point was that the gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability. Again, let me look at just one example, Luke. Luke was the author of a two-part work, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. These are really one work, and they're separated in our Bibles only because the church grouped the Gospels together in assembling the New Testament. Luke is the gospel writer who writes most self-consciously as a historian. In the preface of his work, he writes, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who, from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed." This preface is written in classical Greek, such as was used by the classical Greek historians. After this, Luke switches to a more vulgar or common Greek. But he's put his reader on alert that he can write, should he wish to, in the classical Greek of the learned historian. And he speaks here of his lengthy investigation of the story he's about to tell. He assures us that it is based on eyewitness testimony and is accordingly the truth. Now, who was this author we call Luke? He was clearly not an eyewitness to Jesus' life because he depended upon the reports of eyewitnesses. But we discover an important fact about him from the book of Acts. Beginning in the 16th chapter of Acts, when Paul reaches Troas in modern-day Turkey, the author suddenly starts using the first person plural. We set sail from Troas to Samothrace. We remained in Philippi for some days as we were going to the place of prayer, etc. The most obvious explanation is that the author had joined Paul on his evangelistic tour of the Mediterranean cities. Eventually, he accompanies Paul back to Israel and finally to Jerusalem. What this means is that the author of Luke Acts was in fact in first-hand contact with the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry in Jerusalem. Skeptical critics have done backflips to try to avoid this conclusion. They say that the use of the first-person plural in Acts should not be taken literally. It was just a literary device, which was common in ancient sea voyage stories. Never mind that many of the passages in the book of Acts took place on land, not on the sea. The more important point is that this theory, when you check it out, turns out to be sheer fantasy. There just was no literary device in the ancient world of sea voyages narrated in the first person plural. The whole thing has been shown to be a scholarly fiction. There's no avoiding the conclusion that Luke Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul who had the opportunity to interview eyewitnesses to Jesus' life while in Jerusalem. So, who were some of these eyewitnesses? Perhaps we can get some clue by subtracting from the Gospel of Luke everything found in the other Gospels and seeing what is unique to Luke, what his unique sources were. When you do this, what you discover is that many of Luke's unique narratives are connected to women who followed Jesus. People like Joanna and Susanna, and significantly, Mary, Jesus' mother. Well, was the author reliable in getting his facts straight? The book of Acts enables us to answer that question decisively. The book of Acts overlaps significantly with the secular history of the ancient world, and the historical accuracy of Acts is indisputable. This has recently been demonstrated anew by Colin Heemer, a classical scholar who turned to New Testament studies in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Heemer goes through the book of Acts with a fine-toothed comb, pulling out a wealth of historical detail, ranging from what would have been common knowledge down to details which only a local person would have known. Again and again and again, Luke's accuracy is demonstrated. From the sailings of the Alexandrian corn fleet out of Egypt to the coastal terrain of the Mediterranean islands visited by Paul, to the peculiar and shifting titles of the local officials, Luke gets it right. According to Professor Sherwin-White, the confirmation of historicity in Acts is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. The judgment of Sir William Ramsay, a world-famous archaeologist, still stands. Luke, he said, is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed among the very greatest of historians. Given Luke's care and demonstrated reliability, as well as his contact with eyewitnesses within the first generation after the events, this author is trustworthy. On the basis of these 5 reasons that I've listed, I personally think that we should assume that the Gospels are historically reliable in what they say about Jesus, unless they are proven to be wrong on some particular point. But in any case, at the very least, we cannot assume that they are wrong until they are proven to be right. We should at least adopt a position of neutrality in approaching the Gospels. Now, if we do adopt a position of neutrality when approaching the Gospels, how do we move beyond neutrality to the affirmation that some event is actually historical? Well, historians have developed a number of so-called criteria of authenticity to enable us to do that. It's vital that these criteria be properly stated and understood, for they've often been grossly misused. The criteria are really signs of historical credibility. A story in the Gospels exhibiting one of these signs is, all things being equal, more likely to be historical than it would have been without it. In other words, the presence of one of these signs increases the probability that the recorded event is historical. Well, what are some of these signs of historical authenticity? Here is a list of some of the most important. 1, historical fit. The incident fits in with known historical facts of the time and place. 2, independent early sources. The incident is related in multiple sources which are near to the time when the incident is said to have occurred and which don't rely on each other or on a common source. Independent early sources. 3, embarrassment. The incident is awkward or counterproductive for the early Christian church. 4, dissimilarity. The incident is unlike earlier Jewish ideas and or unlike later Christian ideas. 5, Semitisms. Traces of Hebrew or Aramaic language spoken by Jesus' countrymen appear in the story. And 6, coherence. The incident fits in with facts already established about Jesus. Now, notice a couple of things about these criteria. First, they are all positive signs of historical credibility. Therefore, they can only be used to establish historicity, not to deny it. If a story is not embarrassing or dissimilar or found in early independent sources, that obviously doesn't mean that the incident is not historical. The only way you could justifiably use the criteria to deny historical credibility would be by presupposing that the Gospels are unreliable until they are proven to be reliable. In other words, we're right back to the burden of proof issue again. If we adopt a position of neutrality in approaching the Gospels, then the failure to prove an incident is historical just leaves you in a position of neutrality. You don't know whether it's historical or not. Second, the criteria don't presuppose the general reliability of the Gospels. The criteria apply to specific instances, not to the whole book. So they can be used to detect historical nuggets of information in any source, even in the apocryphal Gospels or the Koran. That means that in order to defend the historical credibility of some event in the life of Jesus, say his burial, you don't need to defend the historical credibility of other events like his birth in Bethlehem or his feeding of the 5,000 or his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and so on. Specific incidents can be evaluated on their own by these criteria. So if you're arguing on the basis of the criteria that a specific radical claim was made by Jesus and the unbeliever points to other sayings which he thinks are not authentic, that doesn't matter. You're not trying to prove biblical inerrancy. You're trying to show that Jesus made this specific radical claim, and it's just irrelevant whether or not he made some other claim. Before we apply these criteria to events and sayings of Jesus in the gospel, it's worth noting a general problem facing critics who deny that Jesus made any radical claims at all. We know from Paul's letters that within 20 years of Jesus' death, Jesus was regarded and worshiped by his contemporaries as God incarnate. It's inexplicable how monotheistic Jews could have attributed divinity to a man they had accompanied during his lifetime if he had never claimed any such things himself. Monotheism is the heart of the Jewish religion, and it would have been blasphemous to say that a human being was God. And yet this is precisely what the earliest Christians did proclaim and believe about Jesus. Such a claim must have been rooted in Jesus' own teaching. And in fact, we do find in Jesus' teachings and activities both explicit and implicit personal claims which imply his divinity. In the gospel, there are a number of explicit self-descriptions used by Jesus which provide insight into his self-understanding. Until recently, critical scholars have been quite skeptical of the authenticity of such self-descriptions. In 1977, when I was working at the University of Birmingham, a group of 7 British theologians, headed by Professor Hick, caused a great stir in the press and among laymen by publishing a book provocatively entitled The Myth of God Incarnate. In it, they asserted that today the majority of New Testament scholars agree that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah or the Son of God, or indeed any of the divine titles attributed to him in the Gospels. Rather, these titles developed in the Christian church and then were written back into the stories handed down about Jesus, so that in the Gospels he appears to claim these titles for himself. Thus, the divine Christ of the Gospels who appears as God incarnate is a myth and ought to be rejected. Today, no such skeptical consensus exists. On the contrary, the balance of scholarly opinion on Jesus' use of personal titles may have actually tipped in the opposite direction. Let's take a look at the authenticity of some of Jesus' explicit claims. And as we look at each title, what I'll do is first show by means of the criteria of authenticity that Jesus did make such a claim, and then secondly, I'll discuss the significance of that claim for who Jesus held himself to be. We'll leave it there. First, the Messiah. Israel's ancient hope for a Messiah or anointed one sent by God had revived during the century prior to Jesus' birth. The most important messianic concept was the idea of a descendant of King David who would become king over Israel and the nations. More than just a warrior king, he would also be the spiritual shepherd of Israel. The Greek word for Messiah is Christos, or Christ. Early Christians connected this title so closely to Jesus that it practically became a proper name, Jesus Christ. The very term used to describe his followers, Christians, showed how central their belief was that Jesus was the promised Messiah. The question is, where did they come up with this idea? If Jesus himself never claimed to be the Messiah, what would prompt his followers to call him that? He did not, in fact, reestablish David's throne in Jerusalem. Instead, he was crucified by his enemies. Even the belief that God had raised him from the dead would not have led his followers to see him as the Messiah, for there was just no connection between resurrection and messiahship. Only if Jesus had been crucified because he had claimed to be the Messiah would his resurrection lead his followers to see him as the risen Messiah. Moreover, there's good evidence that Jesus did in fact think that he was the Messiah. For example, there's the story of Peter's famous confession in Mark 8:27-30. I read, "And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, 'Who do men say that I am?' And they told him, 'John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And he asked them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Peter answered him, 'You are the Messiah.'" Is this a historical incident? It would be natural for people of that time to be interested in who Jesus claimed to be. Independent accounts tell us that John the Baptist was confronted with a similar question. Luke chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, and John 1, 19-27. No doubt the disciples who had left their families and jobs to follow Jesus would have asked themselves whom they were following. Peter's reply to Jesus' question is independently confirmed in John 6, verse 69, where Peter says, "We have believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Another story illustrating Jesus' messianic self-consciousness is the story of Jesus' answer to John the Baptist in prison in Matthew 11, 2-6, and Luke 7, 19-23. Many scholars think that this story comes from a very old source, which is shared by Matthew and Luke, called the Q source. John asks Jesus, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" The phrase, "he who is to come," harks back to John's prophecy of him who comes after me, which is independently recorded in Mark 1:7 and John 1:27. The criterion of embarrassment supports the historicity of this incident, since John the Baptist seems to be doubting Jesus. Jesus' answer to John is a blend of prophecies from Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, 26, verse 19, and 61, 1, the last of which explicitly mentions being God's anointed one. Jesus says, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the good news preached to them, and blessed is he who takes no offense at me." Perhaps most remarkably of all, these very signs are listed as signs of the Messiah's coming in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Jewish sect that lived at Qumran at the time of Jesus. And I'm referring to Dead Sea Scroll 4Q 521. 4Q 521. In sum, the criteria of historical fit, embarrassment, and coherence with other authentic material, coupled with its presence in a very early source, give good grounds for seeing this incident as historical. But even more convincing than Jesus' words are Jesus' actions, which disclose his sense of being the Messiah. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem, seated on a donkey, was a dramatic, provocative assertion of his messianic status. The story is independently told by Mark in chapter 11, verses 1 to 11, and John 12, verses 12 to 19. They agree on the core of the story. 1 week before his death, Jesus rode into Jerusalem seated on the back of a colt and was hailed by the Passover festival crowds with shouts of Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, in anticipation of the coming of David's kingdom. In mounting a colt and riding into Jerusalem, Jesus is deliberately fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. I quote, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus is deliberately and provocatively claiming to be the promised king of Israel. Skeptical scholars have sometimes questioned the historicity of this incident because such a public demonstration would have led to Jesus' immediate arrest by the Romans. But this is a very weak objection. A man mounted on a slowly moving donkey with no show of arms would hardly have looked menacing to the Romans. His triumphal entry was not something the Romans were expecting or would have understood, and the procession probably just melted into the crowd once it got to Jerusalem. According to Mark 11:11, upon his arrival, Jesus just looks around and then leaves. He does nothing to provoke arrest by the Roman authorities. Virtually all critics acknowledge that during the following week, Jesus did cause some sort of a disturbance in the Jerusalem temple, which resulted in a temporary halt to commercial activities there. The last sentence of Zechariah's prophecy is, "There shall no longer be traders in the house of the Lord on that day." Zechariah 14:21. Jesus is deliberately fulfilling these prophecies, asserting his authority in the holiest precincts of Judaism. The temple comes up again at Jesus' trial. We have independent reports that Jesus had made a prophecy about the temple's destruction, Mark 14:58 and John 2:19, which the Jewish authorities sought to turn against him. In Jewish literature of Jesus' day, God is identified as the one who built the temple and who threatens to destroy it. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Messiah is called the Son of God who will build the temple. The Son of God is the Messiah who will build the temple, 4Q 174. At the trial, Jesus is accused of claiming to do the same thing. His refusal to answer these charges provokes the high priests to demand, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Mark 14:26. This accusation shows that Jesus was on trial for his messianic claims. The Roman authorities at that time reserved for themselves the right to capital punishment, so the Jewish authorities could not execute Jesus. But Jesus' claim to be the Messiah could then be represented to the Roman authorities as treasonous so that they would execute Jesus. Independent sources testified that the plaque nailed to the cross over Jesus' head, recording the charge against him, read, "The King of the Jews." Mark 15:26 and John 19:19. The criterion of dissimilarity also supports the authenticity of this charge, for the title, "The King of the Jews," was never a title used for Jesus by the early church. Historical scholars see this charge against Jesus as so firmly established that it is historical bedrock. The overlapping of so many factors, each ratified by criteria such as independent sources, historical fit, dissimilarity, and so on, makes a powerful cumulative case that Jesus did in fact see himself as the Jewish Messiah. Now, in claiming to be the Jewish Messiah, Jesus did not necessarily say anything superhuman. Scholars typically take the Messiah to be just a human figure. But it must be said that the picture of the Messiah in several pre-Christian Jewish documents is of an extraordinarily exalted figure. In the extra-biblical Psalms of Solomon, for example, he is called the Lord Messiah, who will strike the earth with his mouth forever, and he himself will be free from sin, and he will not weaken in his days. Psalms of Solomon 17, verses 32 to 37. In Isaiah, we read, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace," Isaiah 9:6. Here, the title Mighty God is given to the Messiah, whose reign, Isaiah goes on to say, will be without end. In the first century extra-biblical Similitudes of Enoch, the Messiah is portrayed as a godlike figure who has existed with the Lord, quote, "prior to the creation of the world and for eternity." 1 Enoch 48:6. So the idea of the Messiah as a heavenly, divine figure was afoot in Jesus' day. When we come to Jesus' self-understanding, notice that John the Baptist is described as the fulfillment of Malachi and Isaiah's prophecies of a messenger crying in the wilderness. Malachi 3:1 says, "Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way for me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." Malachi 3:1. And Isaiah says, "A voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Isaiah 40 and verse 3. Now in Matthew 11 and verse 10 and Luke 7:27, Jesus himself identifies John the Baptist as the messenger of Malachi 3:1. So, who is to come after the messenger, according to these prophecies? It is the Lord, God himself. Jesus goes on to speak of himself as the Son of Man who has come after John, Matthew 11:19 and Luke 7:34. And as we'll see, the Son of Man is a divine human figure who could fulfill both the divine and the human aspects of John's prediction. So, with the title Messiah, Jesus may well be ascribing to himself a divine status. Now, we've already seen that at Jesus' trial, the high priest challenged him about being the Son of God. This is also a claim that Jesus often makes in the gospel. So let's look at 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be the Son of God. First, consider Jesus' parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard in Mark 12, verses 1 to 9. I quote, "A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and let it out to tenants and went into another country. When the time came, he set a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again he sent to them another servant, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And so with many others, some they beat and some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But those tenants said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours.' And they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others." Now, in this parable, the vineyard symbolizes Israel. Compare Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. The owner is God. The tenants are the Jewish religious leaders, and the servants are the prophets sent by God. The tenants beat and reject the owner's servants. Finally, the owner decides that he has one left to send, his only beloved son. "They will respect my son," he says. But instead, the tenants kill the son because he is the heir of the vineyard. Even skeptical scholars recognize the authenticity of this parable because it's also found in one of their favorite sources, the Gospel of Thomas, verse 65. And so is, by their reckoning, independently confirmed. Moreover, the parable not only reflects the actual experience of absentee landlords in the ancient world, but also employs typical images and themes found in Jewish parables. Israel as a vineyard, God as the owner, unworthy rebellious tenants, the figure of a son, and so on, so that it fits well within a Jewish context. The parable also contains interpretive nuances rooted in the Aramaic paraphrases of Isaiah 5, which were in use in Jesus' day. There are furthermore aspects of the parable which make it unlikely that the parable originated later in the Christian church. For example, the concern in the parable over who should possess the vineyard after it is taken from the present tenants would be a non-issue for the early Christians, since Rome destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And the absence of the resurrection of the Son in the parable doesn't fit in well with early Christians' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Now, what does this parable tell us about Jesus' self-understanding? It tells us that he thought of himself as God's only Son, distinct from all the prophets, God's final messenger, and even the heir of Israel itself. Notice that you cannot delete the figure of the Son from the parable as an inauthentic later addition, for then the parable lacks any climax and point. Moreover, the uniqueness of the Son is not only explicitly stated in the parable, but it's inherently implied by the tenant's plan to murder the heir in order to claim the possession of the vineyard. So this parable discloses to us that Jesus believed and taught that he was the only Son of God. Jesus explicitly claims to be God's Son in Matthew 11:27. You could compare Luke 10:22, and I quote, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Now again, there's good reason to accept this as an authentic saying of Jesus. It's a saying of Jesus from a source shared by Matthew and Luke, the Q document. It is therefore very early. The saying has also been shown to go back to an original Aramaic version, which counts in favor of its authenticity. Moreover, it's unlikely that the early Christians invented this saying because it says that the Son is unknowable. No one knows the Son except the Father, it says, which would exclude even Jesus' followers from knowing him. But the conviction of the post-Easter church is that we can know the Son, Philippians 3, verses 8 to 11. So this saying is unlikely to be the product of later church theology. So, what does this saying tell us about Jesus' self-concept? It tells us that he thought of himself as the exclusive Son of God and the only revelation of God the Father to mankind. On the basis of this saying, we can conclude that Jesus thought of himself as God's Son in an absolute and unique sense, and as invested with the exclusive authority to reveal his Father God to men. Finally, another interesting saying revealing Jesus' sense of being God's Son is his saying concerning the date of his return. Quote, "But of that day or that hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Mark 13:32. It seems highly unlikely that this saying is the later product of Christian theology because it ascribes ignorance to the Son. The criterion of embarrassment requires the authenticity of the reference to the Son's ignorance. Just how embarrassing the saying was is evident in the fact that although Matthew reproduces it in Matthew 24:36, Luke omits it. And most copyists of Matthew's gospel also chose to drop the verse, though it is preserved in the best manuscripts. That Mark preserves this saying despite his emphasis on Jesus' predictive power and foreknowledge is testimony to his faithfulness in handing on the traditions about Jesus. Here once more we see Jesus' consciousness of being God's unique Son. So on the basis of these three sayings of Jesus, we have good evidence that Jesus thought of himself as the unique Son of God. Once again, however, we've not yet arrived at an unambiguous affirmation of divinity. For although Gentile readers of the Gospels would be apt to interpret the expression Son of God in divine terms, in a Jewish context this was not the customary sense of the title. Jewish kings were traditionally referred to as God's sons. And in Jewish literature, a righteous man could be characterized as God's child, having God as his father. But given the uniqueness and the exclusivity of Jesus' claim, such generic usage is really irrelevant to Jesus' claim to divine sonship. We've seen that Jesus thought of himself as God's Son in a singular sense that set him apart even from the prophets who had gone before. But what was that sense? The answer may be once more that Jesus thought of himself as God's unique sense merely in the sense that he was the promised Messiah. The non-biblical book 4 Ezra 7 verses 28 and 29 speaks of Messiah as God's Son, but nonetheless as mortal. Quote, "My Son the Messiah shall be revealed, and those who remain shall rejoice 400 years. And after these years my Son the Messiah shall die, and all who have human breath." End quote. The Dead Sea Scrolls also show that the Messiah was thought to be God's Son. The uniqueness of Jesus' sonship could be a function of the uniqueness of the Messiah. Since there's only one Messiah, there is only one Son of God. On the other hand, it must be said in all honesty that these Jewish texts do not even approach the sort of absoluteness and exclusivity claimed by Jesus in the sayings we've examined. There's nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls to suggest that the Messiah is the only Son of God. Being the Messiah might set Jesus apart from all the other prophets who had come before and make him the heir of Israel, as claimed in the parable of the vineyard. But being a merely human Messiah would not give him exclusive knowledge of God the Father or make him the absolute revelation of God as claimed in Matthew 11:27. Moreover, the saying in Mark 13:32 not only discloses Jesus' sense of unique sonship, but also presents us with an ascending scale from men to the angels to the Son to the Father, a scale on which Jesus' sense of being God's Son involved a proximity to the Father which transcends that of any human being, such as a king or a prophet, or even any angelic being. Such an exalted conception of God's Son is not foreign to first century Judaism. The New Testament itself bears witness to this fact in various passages like Colossians 1:13-20 and Hebrews 1:1-12. Similarly, in 4 Ezra, chapter 13, Ezra sees a vision of a man arising out of the sea who is identified by God as my son and who proceeds to subdue all the nations. The Son is portrayed in this book as a pre-existent heavenly figure who is revealed on earth at the proper time. So, we have here the same ambiguity with the title the Son of God that we encountered in dealing with the title Messiah. These titles have many different meanings and are therefore ambiguous when taken out of context. In order to understand the meaning that Jesus invested in such self-descriptions, we therefore need to look at Jesus' teaching and actions. But before we do that, there's one more title, the most significant of all, which demands our attention, and that is the title, the Son of Man. It's very likely that Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. This was Jesus' favorite self-description and is the title found most frequently in the Gospels, over 80 times. And yet, remarkably, this title is found only once outside the Gospels in the rest of the New Testament, Acts 7:56. That shows that the designation of Jesus as the Son of Man was not a title that arose in later Christianity and was then written back into the traditions about Jesus. Rather, on the basis of the criteria of independent sources and of dissimilarity, we can say with confidence that Jesus called himself the Son of Man. Now, the key question then becomes the meaning of the phrase. Some critics maintain that in calling himself Son of Man, Jesus merely meant a human person, just as the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel referred to himself as a Son of Man. But with Jesus, there's a crucial difference. For Jesus did not call himself a Son of Man, but the Son of Man. Jesus' use of the phrase with the definite article, the, is consistent throughout the gospel. By using the definite article, Jesus was directing attention to the divine human figure prophesied in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Daniel describes his vision in the following way, and I quote, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." That Jesus believed in the appearance of the figure described in Daniel's vision is reported in independent sources, such as Mark 8:38, Matthew 10:32-33, and elsewhere in the Gospels. In Daniel's vision, the figure looks like a human being, but he comes on the clouds of heaven, and to him is given a dominion and glory which properly belongs to God alone. Other Jewish writings outside the Bible speak similarly of the Son of Man. The similitudes of Enoch describe the pre-existent Son of Man in 1 Enoch 48, verses 3 to 6, who shall, quote, depose the kings from their thrones and kingdoms, and shall sit upon the throne of his glory. 1 Enoch 69:29. And I've also mentioned the similar vision in 4 Ezra 13, in which Ezra sees something like the figure of a man come up out of the heart of the sea, whom the Most High identifies as my son. 4 Ezra 13:37, and who pre-exists with the Most High. Now, the point in mentioning these passages is not that people listening to Jesus would have recognized his allusions to such works or such ideas. They evidently did not. But rather that the understanding of Daniel's Son of Man as a divine human figure fits with first century Jewish ideas. By using the indirect expression, the Son of Man, to refer to himself, Jesus prevented a premature revelation of his superhuman and messianic status. Now, some scholars recognize that Jesus believed in a coming end-time figure called the Son of Man. But they claimed that Jesus was talking about somebody else who would come. But such an interpretation, I think, is sheer fantasy. It would require us to say that all of the Son of Man sayings used by Jesus to refer to either himself or to an earthly suffering figure are inauthentic. If even one of these sayings is authentic, then this interpretation is invalid. For example, Matthew 8:38, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, is generally taken to be an authentic saying, but it obviously doesn't refer to some coming end-time figure. Moreover, this interpretation can't make sense of Jesus' claim to ultimate authority. There's something of a scholarly consensus that Jesus had a sense of unsurpassed authority. He put himself in God's place by his words and actions. But then it makes no sense at all to suppose that he thought someone else was coming to judge the world, someone who would in fact judge Jesus himself. Jesus' consciousness of unsurpassed authority is incompatible with the view that he thought someone else was the coming Son of Man. All three of the titles that we've examined so far come together in a remarkable way at Jesus' trial. Mark records in Mark 14, verses 60 to 64, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he was silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his mantle and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. Here, in one fell swoop, Jesus claims that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, and the coming Son of Man. He compounds his crime by adding that he is to be seated at God's right hand, a claim that is truly blasphemous in Jewish ears. The trial beautifully illustrates how, in Jesus' self-understanding, all of the diverse claims blend together, thereby taking on connotations that outstrip any single idea taken out of context. Now, let me pause at this point and ask if you have any comment or question on these explicit claims that Jesus made that reveal his divine self-understanding. Here's one.
The question is, do you think Jesus deliberately kept people at this epistemic distance in order to ensure that people would freely crucify him, and that demons actually wanted the knowledge to be prematurely known, and Jesus rebuked the demons for prematurely proclaiming his divinity?
I think it's very clear that given the prevalent concept of the Messiah in Judaism at that time as a warrior king who would come and subdue the nations with a rod of iron and establish the throne of David in Jerusalem. Jesus did not go about claiming to be the Messiah because it would actually tend to obscure rather than elucidate the true nature of his mission. He thought of himself as Messiah, yes, but not as the sort of warrior king that was prevalent in Judaism. And so he chose this oblique title, the Son of Man, from Daniel 7, which, as I said, prevents a premature revelation of his unique messianic status until such time as his hour had come, and then in the trial scene, it all explodes into view in a remarkable way. What? That's what I say too. When I study this, I think this is incredible stuff. It makes the Gospels come alive in a historical way that it doesn't just reading them in Sunday school class somehow. The Jewishness of it and the authenticity of it strengthens my faith and as you say, fills me with praise.